Thanks very much. I'd like to introduce you all to my wife. She should be up here too, but she's the boss. She said I had to come up here. Jan, raise your hand, please. The 28 books I've done have been edited all by her. She was a math major. I was an English major. And she has the eye. She also did the notes, the bibliography, took care of the photographs, and all of the editing for this Hayakawa book. So we're a team. I hope she'll keep us that way. Hearing about Marshall McLuhan reminded me of something that I read about, totally unaware of until I started doing research on the Hayakawa book, and that is that Marshall McLuhan was the Hayakawa family's paperboy in Canada when S.I. Hayakawa was in high school, which is kind of odd because their names come together again later in history. S.I. Hayakawa was hired at San Francisco State, then called State College, under the promise that he would be allowed to begin some kind of general semantics program, an institute, a major. And what happened was that the literature and creative writing teachers blocked every attempt to do this. They blocked it for a couple of reasons. The main reason was just jealousy. Hayakawa was too well known. He was being treated as a celebrity in San Francisco. Also, they would use the excuse that general semantics was a popularized discipline. One famous quote given to me by Professor Manfred Wolff was, this is from Mark Harris, the novelist, Bang the Drum Slowly, the Southpaw. Harris supposedly said at a meeting, I don't think we ought to turn freshman composition over to an unscholarly discipline. And when Hayakawa asked him what he meant, he said, because general semantics is a popularized discipline, and I don't think we should concern ourselves with unscholarly approaches. Well, there's a deep irony there because, first of all, I think most of us would agree that more than any other individual, Hayakawa presented the complexities of general semantics as an understandable subject. And it was turned against him by both fans and enemies. There were people in the GS community, of course, who resented this as well. They probably should have. Hayakawa had been raised as a social outsider, and he had worked his way inside by dint of talent and determination. By the time he reached San Francisco and was being rejected, he had learned how to deal with knee-jerk opposition to general semantics and to himself. He was, among other things, a tough guy. Growing up Japanese, where he was, when he was, you couldn't be soft. Jan and I knew, he was called Don by all his friends. Jan and I knew Don fairly well. We knew him for 30 years. He'd been one of my teachers. And I thought we knew a good deal about him, but we didn't. He lived many lives. He was worth 2 or 3 novels. I don't think one novel would have done it because no one would have believed it. There were so many changes that occurred in his life. But he was a character, a novelist, which to have great fun on. Until Jan and I began corresponding with his college friends, for example, I didn't know he had been considered not just a poet, but a quite promising poet. Published in Poetry magazine, for example. At that time considered to be the leading place to be published. And I found this little bit of casual poetry he sent to his future wife, Marge. O wise and perfect lady friend, O sizzling babe, O love divine, O thou whom Cupid's doves attend, O thou whom fragrant winds entwine, O phoenix in the phoenix nest, O non-parallel, O epogee, O swell with every beauty blessed, wilt thou my palsy-walsy be, and share with me the rapture sweet of hearts in harmony complete, beat soft retreat from time's defeat, and meet at the drugstore down the street. That playfulness had a lot, I think it was illustrated in his work with general semantics, with all the crazy ways and directions in which he took it. And that's exactly what a creative writer needs, by the way. You're not going to be able to write short stories and novels that are interesting to people if you can't reach out and make unusual configurations, see associations that the average person isn't probably seeing. We also didn't know he'd been a fencing coach, a Canadian military cadet, or that long before his San Francisco years, he'd rubbed elbows with a whole cadre of celebrities. Langston Hughes was a good buddy. Mahalia Jackson, Frank Lloyd Wright, Frederick March, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and on and on and on. This is all basically new stuff to me. Another surprise was the number of accomplished and sometimes famous people who credited Hayakawa's book Language and Thought in Action with making them more effective language users. I've written for The Nation, I've written for Xavier, I've written for this, that, and the other magazine. I can't tell you how many editors will say, oh, you're writing on that Hayakawa fellow. I love that book of his. These are people older than me. So they read it back in the 1940s, in all likelihood, or the 1950s. I was not ready for that kind of response. Unfortunately, the biggest surprise, as Jan and I interviewed or corresponded with folks, was how few mentioned general semantics. Memories are short, and only the most recent buzz seems to stick with a lot of people. Some referred to Hayakawa as a linguist, which he wasn't in any formal sense, as a semanticist, which he also wasn't in a technical sense, as a lexicographer, which he was to a limited degree. He was involved in the compilation of 2 dictionaries, or as a newspaper columnist, which he was to a limited degree, but to a very interesting degree, I must say, because of the variety of things upon which he wrote. Time magazine, I think, was probably closest to correct when it called him a word man. And this probably brings up this question I'm sure you've all discussed one time or another about why general semantics is called general semantics. I didn't really know until I read Bruce Curtis's recent book, and which I much enjoyed and highly recommend, by the way, the way in which those decisions were made. But Hayakawa is now, in California at least, he's remembered largely as a senator who slept and a college president who stopped the radicals. And that's about where it stops when you talk to people. The thing I heard, I think, most frequently when they would hear people who knew me and who were familiar with my work would say, oh, you're writing about Hayakawa now. Sleepin' Sam, eh? And there's a deep irony in that somebody who was a word man was so done in by words, by other people's words. The words became their reality. What was happening beneath the words on the less abstract level, people don't know about, they don't seem to care about. Hayakawa certainly was not in the deep way in which Alfred Korzybski was any kind of a language scholar or theorist. That wasn't the way his mind worked. And like it or not, whether their names are linked in the minds of those of us in our generation at least. A lot of members of the ISGS in San Francisco credit Don with having enlivened the overall study of language on the West Coast, the whole West Coast. And not just general semantics, but other forms, things like dialectology. He was, of course, kind of an amateur dialectologist, too, a pretty skilled amateur dialectologist. And a lot of Don's ex-students, his acolytes, teach versions of general semantics in West Coast secondary schools and colleges. It tends to be what I call general semantics Lite, simply because it's taught in rhetoric or composition or logic courses. And it reflects very often the range of materials that Hayakawa published in etc. Review of General Semantics when he was editor. Looking for those connections over here and over there. I'm sure that were he alive today, he'd be probably writing about the NFL strike in general semantics in some way, and how the words of management and labor or something of that kind created images. The thing about him that I think no one really argues about is that he was a gifted writer, and he really was a gifted writer. His own essays and speeches were often characterized by irreverence and a certain creative playfulness, such as that poem illustrated. I mean, here's some titles. Sexual Fantasy in the 1957 Automobile, How to Be Sane, Though Negro, The Revision of Vision, Popular Songs versus the Facts of Life. And you can go down a long, long, long list, and a lot of them say, where do these titles lead you? But what he does to some degree is poke his fingers into the ribs of convention and to test assumptions that way. His work evidenced his own wide reading, and general semantics, I think, is always visible in all his work, although it's not necessarily what I would call core of all the work. My introduction to the subject came in an undergraduate course at San Francisco State 50 years ago, taught by Dean Barnland, another name that's not well remembered anymore, but was important at that time. Dean Barnland was one of the Northwestern folks. And then that led me to take a couple graduate seminars with Hayakawa. Barnland's core text was Language, Meaning, and Maturity, the anthology by Hayakawa. Hayakawa's core text was Science and Sanity. And this is why I call it General Semantics Lite, the way he did it. The course was offered in the English department, and the enrollees were at least 90% were either future teachers or aspiring writers. There weren't people from the sciences in those courses. My buddy, the guy I sat with in these seminars, was a guy named Stephen Gaskin. You may know who Stephen is. He started something called, I think it's called The Farm, a big commune, and became quite a famous person in San Francisco for a while. He was very much an applied general semanticist. In any case, class discussions in Hayakawa's class centered on practical applications of Korzybski's insights. Hayakawa made certain we knew and applied various devices and insights that had come from the master, L and non-L, indexing, dates, quotation marks, etc., etc. And he wanted those things to be reflected in what we did in our presentations, and he hoped in our work as we left his class and became professional writers, those of us who did that. But Korzybski's work seemed to be only a jumping off point to Hayakawa. Charles Stade said that Hayakawa never understood anything that Korzybski said. I think he understood some of it. He used to employ a lot of subtext from Wendell Johnson, from Irving Lee, and he also liked people like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and that work made its way into his class. But as I say, there was not really a deep discussion of colloids, for example, the mathematical basis, and it would have been a waste of time. My wife, as I said, was a math major, and I would have gone to her with tears in my eyes if he'd started in on Korzybski's math, but he didn't. During those seminars, he tried to direct us and show us the underlying realities of things like jazz and racism and psychosis and various kinds of political problems, political speech in particular. But, I have to honestly say that until I read Korzybski, the recent biography, I was unaware of how intense the tension between Korzybski and the Institute was and the society. I was out there where the society dominates, and I basically just heard their side of it, interviewed those folks, and there was clearly tension, but it didn't seem to be quite as divisive as it turns out that I guess it was. I never heard Hayakawa not speak respectfully of Korzybski. He tried to talk me into writing my doctoral dissertation on Korzybski. This was 45 years ago. And I was going in another direction by that time and ended up writing on literature. But he was a promoter, but he did, in my experience, seem to find certain affectations that I suppose are real, true, and troublesome. But he just didn't dwell on those. He said they had some personality clashes, and he laughed. He said that Korzybski hated it when Hayakawa would fall asleep in the middle of a lecture, which is something he apparently did all his life, apparently troubled by some form of narcolepsy or another. We don't know for sure because I never could get that particular medical record. But as different as Hayakawa and Korzybski were, in many ways, both seem to have been creative, independent, and unfortunately frustrated. Korzybski's work isn't much discussed in West Coast circles today. They don't go that far in their classes very often, at least the ones that I've been auditing. But it has become vogue for some of Hayakawa's advocates to undervalue Count Korzybski's importance, just as some admirers of Korzybski trivialize Hayakawa's contributions. Korzybski's mind dug much deeper into the theoretical underpinnings of language and other behavior, while Hayakawa scanned for wider and wider possible applications of GS. Each seemed, as I said, to be creative in a unique way as well as driven, which may in part explain some of the tension between them. Trouble was probably inevitable since an ongoing problem for all primary researchers like Korzybski is that if their work is thought to be good, somebody's going to come along and try to take it in another direction. The secondary and tertiary people are going to come in and they're going to expand on what is done. I mean, you just think of, for example, the DNA work of Rosalind Franklin and Raymond Gosselin and what happened when Crick and Watson got a hold of it. All four of those are very important scientific figures, not just as Korzybski is an absolutely seminal figure in this study, but he's not the terminal figure. He's a beginning figure. Hayakawa is someplace next after Korzybski, and that's true, I think, of Irving Lee, and we could go down the list of the others as well, who I guess are considered pioneers now. Since we reached this, since I'm 75 and I was a student when I learned this, I have to keep these things in perspective. Today, the researchers in California, people working in California, seem all to be doing applications. There's some things being done on the contemporary election, for example, from that perspective. I don't see any investigation of Korzybski's own work. I mean, I think that I don't see Science 2012 being sought to upgrade science in 1950. There, now there may be going on, but maybe I wouldn't because I'm a writer. I'm not a practicing teacher of semantics or general semantics. Certainly, it's frustrating though in wondering where things are at any given point in time because there's not a lot of communication about this anymore among academics in California, where I live, or on the West Coast, where I tend to do lectures. As far as Jen and I could tell, Hayakawa never fancied himself as a theorist. I remember once he was talking about the ladder of abstraction and that as being something he had developed, and I said, well, gosh, it looks an awful lot like a structural differential to me. And one went up and one went down, and he said, but I said, in reality, there's no direction involved in this. It could go left or right, and you could still have the same theory. And he said, that's right. And that was one of the things about him, was that he took if you objected to what he was saying, he listened. He would disagree with anyone and allow them to disagree with him as long as they would listen. Without the listening, he shut the door. But if you would listen to him, he would listen to you and would listen attentively. And sometimes, in your presence, change his mind. My God, I didn't know people still did that. Well, Don was born in Vancouver, BC, Canada, in 1906. So when the big strike erupted at San Francisco State in 1968, he was a formed personality. He was bringing values that had been formed in a much earlier generation. He was not somebody who was apt to suddenly get naked and run through the quad with the students. He was the oldest of 4 children of Otoko and Ichiro Hayakawa. His father, Ichiro, was bilingual and an aggressive businessman. And so he moved his family inland to towns and villages with little or no Japanese population. So Don grew up with scant reinforcement of that ancestral heritage. He played hockey. He read American and British authors. He played pop and jazz tunes on the ukulele and the piano. He said that was social grease for him. He also flew in the face of admonitions not to make himself conspicuous, always seeming to earn attention. He admitted that he grew up thinking of himself as a Canadian, not as a Japanese. In 1924, 2 years after Don graduated from high school, a defining event occurred. His parents returned to Japan, and they left in Canada their 2 teenage sons, Sam and Fred. He was called Sam then. And they did that because the boys did not really speak Japanese. They were not Japanese culturally. And the Japanese military, the jingoist military, was beginning to control the country, and those boys would have been snapped up into the military immediately, where they would have been in for tough times indeed because of their inability to communicate. So they made a hard decision. They left the boys in Canada. Don stayed with one of his professors at University of Manitoba, and Fred moved in with an uncle in Montreal. Don then completed his BA in 1927. And at the University of Manitoba, and he matriculated to McGill in 1928. And while there, some of the really extraordinary parts of his life began to develop. He became part of the McGill group. And you've studied Canadian literature, you know that that group of poets, young poets and writers, including people like Leo Kennedy and Frank Scott, Abraham Klein, Leon Adele, are often credited with introducing modernism into Canadian letters. And this fellow, I think most of us think of as our kind of a semanticist, was at that point seen as an important literary figure. In 1930, he won a fellowship at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. As a teaching assistant there, he met Margaret Marge Peters, a freshman, who later became his wife. In 1934, he co-founded a literary magazine called The Rocking Horse. And his circle and friends there suddenly included luminaries like Delmar Schwartz, Leslie Fiedler, Charlotte Shapiro, Maurice Zolotoff, and Ken Purdy. Again, well-known writers who were at the beginnings of their careers. And he was one of the gang, but he was sort of the leader of the gang. He completed his PhD in literature with a dissertation on Oliver Wendell Holmes. And at that point, he thought he would be a professional poet, if there is such a thing, but he thought he ought to have a PhD in case he wanted to eat. And he was also something of a raconteur. He rode a bright red motorcycle around campus and sported this beautiful, tall, blonde girlfriend at a time when that was not very popular for a Japanese Canadian. But he finished his PhD, and it was a period of terrible anti-Japanese prejudice in the United States because of the dawning of World War II and all the events that were happening as this jingoistic Japanese government began to move into Asia in search of resources. He couldn't find a teaching job. He had publications in places like PMLA, and Swanee Review, and Dalhousie Review, and he had a PhD, and he couldn't get jobs that were given to white people with MAs. And he could read what that meant. He understood what racism was and that he was being excluded. But again, it says something perhaps about Hayakawa's personality, that he didn't formally complain ever. He just dug in and as he put it, be better than they are. He was better than they were. That was his hope. He ended up teaching freshman comp at the University of Wisconsin Extension. And while I was there, he married Marge, and he read Stuart Chase's Tyranny of Words. He especially wanted to know how spellbinders like Adolf Hitler and Father Coughlin and Huey Long did it. Demagoguery fascinated him. And the Chase book helped. When, for instance, the Fuhrer declared that the personification of the devil as a symbol of all evil assumes the living shape of the Jew, Don Hayakawa simply noted that among his pals were Ed Mayer, Charlotte Shapiro, Maurice Zolotoff, Abe Klein, Leslie Fiedler, each of them unique individuals who happened to include Jewishness among many characteristics. None slaughtered Christian babies. And Don Hayakawa knew the whole thing was a lie, that abstractions like the Jew were just self-serving fictions. He hoped Korzybski's work would give him a means to explain how and why. So he had to tackle Science and Sanity. He sent for a copy, received it, and he wrote to his wife. He was away on a fellowship. He wrote to his wife and said, "Science and Sanity came today, the toughest looking book of all I own. Utterly terrifying. I'm going to develop a headache. There are some 800 pages of it." When he finished reading the formidable tome, he described it as, quote, "an amazing mishmash of ideas, often turgid and wordy." Why would he think that? Its synthesis, though, was original to me. Configurations conventional scholars wouldn't think of because their training taught them to make other assumptions and to see other patterns. During that academic year, he won a summer scholarship to study with Leonard Bloomfield and Thomas Knott, I think the lexicographer's name, at the University of Michigan. Bloomfield was a big-time linguist, not a lexicographer, and also to become a researcher for the Middle English Dictionary. While he was there, Professor Knott said to the class one day, because there was a sort of a buzz among the students about this book, Science and Sanity, and about Alfred Korzybski, and Knott said, "Has anybody here read Science and Sanity?" And Hayakawa made the foolish mistake of raising his hand. No other hands went up. He knew others had been reading the book, but they did raise their hand. And so Professor Knott said, "Would you mind giving us a couple of lectures on Science and Sanity?" And Hayakawa, in his notebook, said, "I came here to learn about Science and Sanity, not to talk about it." Well, he did make those lectures, and he wrote to Korzybski and said, that he needed to know more about science and sanity. He didn't think he grasped it fully. And that led to an invitation to the Chicago seminar, where he went immediately after finishing the summer session at Michigan. Hayakawa described their meeting, he described Korzybski this way. He said he's extremely cordial. He has an engaging, peculiar smile in which the lips, which are full, are set somewhat grimly. The corners thereof turn up delightfully, while his eyes laugh. Later, he explained the whole meeting. He said he greeted me cordially and said, "You've been giving lectures on general semantics at the University of Michigan. You don't know a goddamn thing about it." And he smiled. I just laughed. We got along fine from then on. There had been no one else at Michigan to say anything about general semantics, so what else could I do? And I told him that. Anyway, we became pretty good friends after that, said Hayakawa. Asked about others who were studying at the time, he said it was just a mishmash of people who were studying with Korzybski at that time. Very interesting group of people. He wasn't sure which people were very serious and which ones were just intellectual dabblers. Hayakawa also claimed that Korzybski had a terrible way of feeling that what he said was so important that he had to listen to it a second time, a third time, a fourth time. And Hayakawa was good at napping, as I mentioned earlier, and that led to a little bit of tension. Bill Temperton, a psychologist, a Rorschach psychologist who studied with Korzybski and knew both these men very well, said to me, when you had Hayakawa and Korzybski present, you had two large egos in a small room. Hayakawa described Korzybski's seminars as being extraordinarily interesting because they were unabashed indoctrination sessions, that's a quote, but they broke with the rules that he had learned in academia. Accustomed as I was to strict observance of jurisdictional boundaries of academic life, in which a professor of English never lectures on physics and the physicist never lectures on political science and so on, I found it breathtaking because Korzybski would leap from one discipline to another discipline, and the connections worked. They worked in the mind not only of Korzybski, but in the mind of his listeners. And he came away extraordinarily impressed by that kind of thing. He, on the other hand, had a very practical turn of mind, and he immediately began trying to apply what he was learning from Korzybski to his freshman composition classes. He put together a little mimeoed book that he called Language in Action. And the two people who proofread it for him, this is kind of interesting because Hayakawa seems to encounter other celebrities throughout his life. The two people who proofread it for him were Wright Thomas and Wallace Stegner. And in 1940, Syracuse University took this little mimeoed sheets, and they adopted it for the entire freshman class, over 2,000 students. Well, that made it a hot item for publishers, and Hayakawa chose Harcourt Brace. Then the next stage was, thanks to Korzybski, the new book that was being published by Harcourt Brace was considered by Book of the Month Club. Korzybski told the botanist David Fairchild, who put it in the hands of a selector for the Book of the Month Club. Book of the Month Club, they used to send you a form, and you had to send it back if you didn't want the selection. The form for Hayakawa's book had to be sent back on the 1st of December, 1941. Had it been the 8th of December, 1941, I think you can be sure it would not have been a bestseller. But as it turned out, because of Pearl Harbor, as it turned out, it was a bestseller. It was, and some people still say it was the very first textbook ever to be a bestseller in American publishing history. In any case, Hayakawa suddenly was on the cover of Saturday Review. He enjoyed celebrity status nearly everywhere except where he most wanted it, that is the levels of academia where he hoped he would be invited to teach. The stain of popularizer would linger and limit his prospects forever. One of the most telling moments of my experiences with Don Hayakawa came when I was his assistant editor, etc., and he came into the office. He'd been gone for a week on a lecture tour here on the East Coast, and he'd been lecturing at fairly prestigious universities, and he came in, and we were talking, having coffee, and I asked the naive question, why are you teaching at San Francisco State and not Columbia or Pennsylvania or Yale, where you just gave lectures. And he looked at me, and his face became sad, and he said, because they don't want me. And it struck a note in me of the frustration that he must have felt at that time. Jen and I personally felt Hayakawa's Chicago years, 1940 roughly to 1955, were the most interesting of his life, because he really developed as a mature human being there. And in his ability to reach out into many fields and to be highly competent in many fields were evidenced there. He not only was deeply involved in the general semantics community, but he became the first non-black columnist for the Chicago Defender. He became a noted jazz maven, was on the board of directors of the Jazz Institute, a determined advocate for co-ops. He was on the Consumers Union board of directors, an acknowledged authority on African art, a passionate spokesman for liberal to progressive causes, and of course the editor, etc., review of general semantics. And he also taught first at Illinois Tech and then later at the University of Chicago Extension during those years. It was during those years that most of those celebrity relationships developed. And sadly, it was during those years he almost lost his marriage due to womanizing. He became an American citizen in 1954, and the Hayakawa family moved to San Francisco Bay Area the next year, and he became a professor of language arts at San Francisco State. He also really enlivened the general semantics scene there. People like the Wanderers would tell me that they would get 300-400 people to an evening lecture when Hayakawa was talking. And he began doing his popular songs versus the fact of life lecture over and over and over again with a live band, Turk Murphy's jazz band or Barbara Dane's jazz band. And it would absolutely fill halls. Probably the music, obviously more than the words, but his words were there. He ended up with a long, long string of things like honorary degrees, a dozen honorary degrees. He was a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Psychological Association, the American Sociological Association, and all this long list of those things. So I think that the folks who like to think of him as some sort of a lightweight who was doing comic book general semantics is just silly. There was some gravity there, but he had a different kind of mind. As I said, he reached out. I know in the world of creative writing, that's thought to be a real asset. I think he would have exchanged all his honors, however, for a tenured position at one of the major institutions, what he would see as one of the more prestigious academic institutions in America. That was, I think, was his great frustration, as nearly as I could tell. And he also didn't have illusions of great wisdom, as some folks have said to me about him when I was interviewing them for the book. When Stuart Maper in early 1960s proposed an article for etc., refuting recent attacks on general semantics, and Don wrote him back and said, I'd write the article myself if I could understand GS better. You do it. So he knew that there were gaps in his understanding, just that he was a flawed advocate. Since our book's been published, it has received a strange response. This is, we've been in this publishing game now for a long time, and I know what happens to books. Some are popular, some are not. But this has had very few written reviews, and the book editor at San Francisco Chronicle said they were afraid it was a crony book, pro-Hayakawa, and Hayakawa was a right-winger. And I'm thinking, what Hayakawa are they talking about? Not the one that I know. But we've had far more invitations to give oral presentations. I don't know. 3 issues have dominated the Q&A sessions at these presentations. Hayakawa's defense of World War II internment and relocation of Japanese Americans. He was not interned, as I'm sure most of you know. By the way, Canadians were interned as well as Americans. But he felt as though it broke up the parochialism of the Japanese-American community. So on that basis, he offered mild support for it. He also was involved in helping relocate people from the camps. But that's the first, most important one that seems to come up on the West Coast. His 1969 breaking of the San Francisco State College student strike also comes up a great deal. And one fellow said, "Why did you write about that wretch?" That's a word he used. I hadn't heard that word used in a long time. That wretch who broke the strike. Well, because it happened, because he did break the strike. That's why I wrote about it. And it's kind of interesting. Who won the strike? Well, Hayakawa won the strike. He had an 80.1% approval rating on the field poll, and he waltzed into the United States Senate on the basis of that popularity. But the young people who were striking are now the administrators at San Francisco State. And they've been able to affect virtually every change they wanted to affect, but they've moderated them because they've grown up a little bit too. And finally, the third issue that seems to come up is his term in the United States Senate, 76 to 82. And he is not seen as a successful term, although he did all sorts of rather interesting things. Probably the most interesting aspect of his Senate term to me was that he really had a strongly libertarian stance. He voted, for example, for federally funded abortions for poor women. He supported more effective gun controls. He opposed the Clean Air Act, but he voted to relinquish the Panama Canal. He urged Ronald Reagan to select a female running mate. And he insisted that what consenting adults do in private is just that, private. No more raids on homosexual bathhouses. Those are not conservative stances, and yet he was cast in that light. There was one other thing that he did that I think is extremely important. During the student strike at San Francisco State, he was invited to testify before Congress. And they expected him to give a big tirade about this younger generation and let's bring the militia in. Hayakawa gave them an analogy, and here's what he said. He said, "We've opened the doors at the university a little with special programs that serve hundreds while thousands are clamoring for education. I believe we should open the gates fully, even at enormous expense, to provide educational opportunities at every level for our minority and poor populations. We should mobilize the best brains available, just as we did when the nation was seeking to solve problems of modern science, to solve an educational crisis that means as much to our national welfare as our efforts in outer space." This is at a time when he was being cast as a racist, someone who objected to these things. My conclusion about Hayakawa's behavior during that whole time was that he was a man of an earlier generation, that it was the SDS violence that really bothered him. It wasn't so much their ends. He believed in the egalitarian education. And finally, one last thing. When Hayakawa was in the Senate, he became the victim of a semantic dilemma, and that is very simply that a decision made by his staff cast him in a light that has never been changed. Johnny Carson, whose Tonight Show dominated late-night television, began joking about Hayakawa's dozing. Famous joke of his. What would S.I. Hayakawa's personalized license plate be? ZZZZZZZZ. But Carson offered an opportunity for the senator to appear on his show. Hayakawa's aides, who were mostly young people in their first tour in Washington, thought it would be inappropriate for him to go on the Tonight Show. It would be beneath dignity for him to go on the Tonight Show. They didn't tell him he'd been invited. Now, Hayakawa was, among other things, a gifted public speaker, an entertaining public speaker, a charming public speaker. He made a very good living doing that. And instead of becoming what I think would have happened, he'd become a semi-regular on that show and exchange barbs. He became a joke, and pretty soon Art Buchwald and Herb Cain and Jack Anderson and columnist after columnist after columnist began writing about this non-existent person called Sleepin' Sam. And so on that really very sad note, Hayakawa left the Senate. And when he was asked by a reporter from the LA Times what it would be remembered for, he said, "Sleeping, I guess." Actually, he didn't just sleep, though. Once he left the Senate, he became special advisor to Southeast Asian Pacific Basin matters for George Shultz, and he became the head of U.S. English's campaign to declare a national language. However, he favored multilingualism, which he always said. It was just that he thought we should have one national language. That, I think, was the Canadian in him coming out. So Don Hayakawa was finally undone by a combination of his own flaws and by events beyond his control. The success of his first book made him famous but trapped him academically, and his victorious run for the Senate revealed flaws that bordered on caricature. Those labels were treated as reality, and Hayakawa's actual history of accomplishment was ignored. Although Jan and I continue to hear variations of people throughout, and I still hear every time we go someplace, people come to me and say, you know, that book of his changed my life. He's talking about language and thought and action, still used in many schools in the West Coast. How he'll be remembered in the long run depends on whether words trump actions and whether mockery trumps history. Ironically, precisely the kind of problems that GS deals with. His books are likely to continue to introduce students, I think, to savvy language use. In 1991, along with two of my old professors, Thurston Womack and John Dennis, both of whom had been anti-Hayakawa strikers at San Francisco State, I was invited to have a drink at Hayakawa's residence. And so the three of us went up there together. And while Don, who was obviously failing, was chatting with Thurston Womack, I was talking with Marge. John and I were talking with Marge. Thurston told me after we left that Don had said, "Who are you again?" Don, he was slipping. And Thurston had been his commute partner. And Thurston told him, and he said, "Thurston, do you know I wasted 6 years of my life in the United States Senate?" Unfortunately, that sad evening was the last time I ever saw him. But I think there's a great deal more there. And who knows, maybe we'll have a novel about him next, or based on what he has done next. And that can go range a little more widely than a biography can.